All right, so housekeeping. This thing is broken or not charged or something. Housekeeping. So Friday's lecture didn't record either. And this was about ready to not record, so I'm trying something else.
Okay.
We'll see.
That was a good lecture.
It was, I know, it was brilliant. It was so good.
Now I can do my worksheet.
Tell me how.
Just here, I finished it.
Yeah.
You already have
You should can.
Oh my goodness.
That's a lot of books.
All right, so we looked at prehistory last time. We looked at prehistory last time. Today we're diving into recorded history. So what's the difference between prehistory and recorded history? Yeah.
Prehistory wasn't recorded.
Wasn't recorded. Yeah. There you go. All right, so just a quick review. This is what we looked at on Thursday, Paleolithic period. Remember, nomadic short settlements. What did they have in terms of art history that we looked at? Portable totems, cave painting, pottery, and beads. Not a lot for us to look at. Like the Venus of Willendorf, those little things that they would carry around.
Oh, yeah.
Little statuettes. Then later on, Neolithic period, that was Stonehenge. Those are characterized by megalithic structures and also more stable, longer-term settlements, still mostly nomadic. They didn't settle in those areas for a very long period of time, or at least in those cities for a very long period of time, but nomadic moves around.
Oh.
You're always moving around looking for food, right? All right, so that's what we looked at before. Today, we're going to be looking at
Well, that's so cool.
the urban revolution in the Near East.
Gosh, that's so cool.
The urban revolution is a broad term that essentially means the ability for people to settle in an area and to come up with a culture of their own. So we'll look at what culture means. A lot of people get confused between civilization and culture. Off the top of your head, what's the difference between civilization and culture? Yeah.
Is one smaller than the other?
Not necessarily. They're both about the same, Ed.
The civilization would be a group of people like working together, functioning as a society, and then the culture would be like how they act in their norms.
Yeah, much closer. Yep. So, trying to be the teacher's pet, no kidding.
Oh my shit.
All right, so urban revolution. We're going to be focusing on the urban revolution in the Near East. This is the oldest urban revolution that happened, but there were other urban revolutions that happened. This, for example, is a picture of anyone know where?
Greece.
Inca.
No, the Incas. This is Machu Picchu, right, in the Andes.
Greece.
Right, so this is not the Near East. This is another urban revolution that happened, but it happened later, and it happened totally different. There's no connection between the two. The only connection is there was an urban revolution. But when we talk about the urban revolution, we're really talking about the Near East. All right, so let's look at culture. Culture is learned behavior. It's not genetic, it's not biological. This includes languages, customs, beliefs, technology that is shared by a group. So this is not necessarily a race of people. So when we talk about someone's culture, we're not talking about their race. We're not talking about their upbringing. It's not biological, it's what is your culture, right? That's why we often talk about the Catholic culture. It's totally different from another culture. We can talk about the American culture. We can talk about the Assyrians. Right? So it's a learned behavior, includes languages, customs, beliefs, and technology that's shared by a group. Culture is intertwined with the idea of civilization. We talked about that. Settlement, formation of rules and regulations, and the growth of urban centers. This is an archaeologist who's talking to Neil McGregor. He says, writing is essential for the creation of what we think of as a human civilization. Without writing, you're not going to be able to have a civilization because you're not going to be able to share these norms and these cultures as well. There's one big deviation from this rule. What is a culture or a set of cultures that didn't have any form of specific writing, but they still have culture? A culture. Think local.
Indians?
Yeah, the Native Americans. Native Americans did not have a written language. Everything was done verbally. Everything was done handed down, passed down through word of mouth. So that's one big, deviation from this rule that we have. But otherwise, you really need to have a written language. That it makes the sharing of culture a lot easier. So these are 9, attributes or 9 things that tend to make up a culture. You don't have to have all of these, but it's pretty consistent. You usually find all of these things. So in your handouts, so this may not match the handout. This is just a nice graphic that I found. So just thought it looked nice. But in the civilization, you have 10 items. Development of permanent systems of social regulation. You have to make sure people get along together. Right? You can't have anarchy. If you have anarchy, you don't have a civilization, right? You don't have a culture either.
What's anarchy?
Anarchy, no one's following any rules. There's no rules. Tony?
If culture is learned behavior, what is civilization? Is that just a group of people?
Yeah, so in order to have a civilization, you need to have these things. So culture encompasses these things, but in order to have a civilization, a stable civilization, you need to have a culture, and a lot of those things will overlap with each other. So you need to have, these are kind of the 10 things that archaeologists and the historians will look at to determine whether we can call something a civilization, or whether so I'll back up. How do we call something a civilization versus a tribe? Right? These 10 things, and they're pretty closely tied with culture. So basically, if there is a culture, there is a civilization. Does that make more sense? So the people of Stonehenge, for instance, we would not consider that a civilization. The people who did the cave paintings, we would not consider that a civilization. They didn't have a complex system like we are going to find here in the classes we're looking at from here on. Make sense? So you need to have development of permanent systems of social regulation. Now, a lot of this is history, some of this is sociology, but it's going to play into what we're learning with art history. So that's why we're not looking at pretty pictures yet. Beginning of infighting for control of regulated resources. What does that mean? Basically, people are, instead of fighting over controlled resources, you are going to be working together to share these resources. So you're not going to have one tribe fighting over a river and another tribe fighting over a river and they kill each other to try and get control. Instead, hey, let's co-op. Let's work together. Social bonds outside of the family. So if we are in a culture together, if we're in a group together, we're going to take care of each other, not just our family. Okay? Social bonds, irrigation, makes sense. You have to store water, especially in the areas we're going to be looking at. Social welfare, this just means if Tony's baby is sick, I'm going to help take care of Tony's baby. Not yet. Later. Okay? Agriculture, you need food. Law, you need to have, again, some sort of a system of making sure that people aren't going to be killing each other. Food surplus, so grain storage or animal storage of some sort. Transport and settlement. Okay, so these are the things that you need to have for a civilization. Again, there's going to be a lot of overlap between this, but you can see this is more practical stuff to have for a civilization. This is more not as practical stuff. Remember, we talked about this last time. The reason why you don't see art, or the reason why it's kind of crazy to see art in these prehistoric times, is they didn't have time to create art. They shouldn't have had time to create art. They were too busy trying to feed themselves and find shelter. So again, we talked about how it must have been very important for them to make this art that they did in the caves or Stonehenge, because they're taking away valuable time and resources from staying alive to do this stuff. So it must have been very important. We know it must have had some sort of a cultural or religious significance.
The stuff they used to paint, did they need that for anything else?
Like the
Materials?
The materials? No, not really. They needed the oil lamps to be able to survive in those caves, but beyond that, no. So you can see this is, language, you need to have language for a civilization. Behavior, this is some overlap with civilization. Food, obviously, overlap with civilization, but the kind of food, right? That is going to get into our culture. Attitudes, beliefs, art, drama, music, faith, religion, rituals, customs. This is more not as essential. So when you start to see a culture, that means that it's a highly developed civilization. Because once you have a highly developed civilization, then you can have a culture. If you don't have a civilization, you can't have a culture. Does that make sense? Yeah. That's why we don't talk about the culture of the nomadic peoples. They didn't have one. It was just stay alive. So civilization is made as a means of control in the best possible term. And I say that as the leaders have to control the people, not just because they want to control people, but because if you have one person taking too much of one resource, you're going to have problems for the whole group. So we start to see this development of the common good, the greater good. which incidentally we'll talk about in Catholic social principles. But this is one of the things that is very basic for a civilization, the idea that the welfare of the community is greater than the welfare of me. And once you have that, then you can have a civilization as well. You have agriculture, basis for wealth, we talked about this. Also religion's importance. Early on especially, the leaders would establish themselves as gods, or at the very least godlike, or communicating with the gods. And we'll see this. Stability, even though it's still a relatively good civilization, stability is still pretty fleeting. Things can disappear in a moment. You're gonna have a drought for a few years, your civilization's gone. It's wiped away. So that's why we see this, these ruins, these places where people just didn't settle for very long. All right, so where did this all take place? This is the area we're gonna be looking at. Again, we saw this a little bit last time. This is what's called the Fertile Crescent. Right here, this is the Euphrates River and the Tigris River. And right around here, I think I mentioned this last time, right around here is where the modern day capital of Iraq is. So this is all Iraq. I think I mentioned this last time. We have Kuwait, we have Saudi Arabia, Israel, Syria is all down here, and then obviously Egypt. But this area is where we're going to be focusing on this time, and then we're going to move down into the Nile, into Egypt in the next, in about 3 classes. You can see here the coastlines have changed a little bit. This is your modern day coastline, but
Wait, how come?
just changes in climate, changes in, the earth, things like that. All right, so we're gonna be looking at Sumeria first, which is Sumer, right? So it's just in this area, and it makes sense. You're close to water. You have plenty of fresh water coming down from these 2 rivers. You have a lake, you have a storehouse of resources here, so that just makes sense. That's gonna be an easy place to start to have a civilization. And again, it's not like jungle, but it's more lush than it is today. So when we think of this area of the world today, we think of dry desert. It still sort of was, but it was better. Think of maybe Flagstaff type thing, being a little more, having a little more water, having a little more vegetation than down here in Phoenix. That's kind of more what it was like. Still very sandy, still pretty dry, but not awful. All right, so Sumeria. What did they do? These earliest communities, they had some pretty big developments. The wheel. They developed the wheel. They were also able to cast in bronze and copper. And they also developed the idea of the plow. Right? Instead of using a tool by yourself, by hand, you're going to set up a plow, put it behind an ox or an animal of some sort and do the work for you. But this is kind of 2 hits in one. This is a Sumerian sculpture of someone using a plow, this new invention. So they're doing agricultural tools, they're casting objects in copper and bronze. Sometimes this is referred to as the Bronze Age, but we'll get into that a little bit later. Next, we have probably the most important invention in history, writing. The Sumerians came up with this idea of transporting ideas across time. If you stop and think about it for a minute, this is the reason why the Native Americans never really came up with a system of writing. I tell you something and then you tell someone else and then it works. Why do we need to make symbols on something? And it's kind of a complex thing when you think about it. These symbols mean something for me to be able to say. We take it for granted today, but it wasn't taken for granted. They had to develop this from scratch. And then they had to develop, well, do we do an alphabet? Do we do pictograms? How do we do it? They came up with this system. No, I cannot read it, and I'm not going to try. But cuneiform. So these are tablets. They would make these clay tablets, and they would use a stick to press into the clay, and then they would fire it. And there's all sorts of these that are still around today. They still exist because baked clay is pottery, unless you crack it, and this has been cracked, but unless you crack it, it stays. It's pretty indestructible. So we have everything from receipts to recipes for making beer to codes of laws. We have all sorts of different things, and we can tell quite a bit about their culture. This is why this is the very beginning of history, because we know more about it coming.
How are people able to translate this? How do they ever figure out how to translate?
Because we have written records that kind of overlap. So the Egyptians, for instance, would talk about what the Assyrians were doing. And the very early Greeks would talk about what the very late Assyrians were doing. And the alphabet would change, but we can kind of start to piece it together. It's kind of like doing Sudoku, right? You can tell, all right, this number goes here because, and you can just kind of use logic to figure out the rest. It takes a while to do that.
I had the same questions.
So like, what are those like actual like letters, the holes?
Yeah, yes, the holes are actually they mean something. I don't know exactly what they mean. So here's a drawing of what we saw. It's flipped around a little bit, but you can see these are the imprints that they made. Some of them mean actual words, some of them are just sounds, and this is how it's done. So we have a piece of clay, and then you just have a tool. It's called not a steel, that's something else.
Oh, so
Stylus,
it's clay.
thank you. It's clay, and then you bake it, and it becomes hard. Yeah, it's not rock.
Oh, I thought it was like rock or something.
Now they would carve into rock, and we'll look at that here in a minute.
OMG. Oh my gosh.
That's crazy.
So here's another one.
How do you understand that?
As it develops, so this is an earlier one, right? There's an earlier one. There's more. It looks more like pictures.
Yeah.
And then as it develops, then it becomes simpler. It turns into basically like an alphabet.
Simpler.
Simpler. The direction, the length, the shape, and the relation to other ones matters. So whether you're just using the tip of it and pushing it straight down, or using the end of it, it all matters.
That's so crazy.
Okay, so you can see these smaller ones, smaller. Right?
So how do you make clay though?
Dirt and water, you mix it together and make a paste, like a mud pie.
Oh my gosh.
It's like extra thick.
Yeah, very thick mud, yeah. So we don't have a lot of clay here, but in certain parts of the world you have a type of dirt that can easily be turned into this, yeah.
Oh, so like this sounds really weird, but like the baseball fields, that kind of clay?
Yeah, yep, exactly.
Okay.
Yep, you put water in that, and then you bake it, and it's not going to be as good as this. There's now more specific ones, but yeah, Play-Doh, same sort of thing. Okay. So how else do we know? How else do we know what they were saying here? Well, we can tell quite a bit by having some other depictions alongside of it. So again, this is like detective work here, trying to figure out what's going on. And this is why context matters. Right? Context. We're trying to understand what the civilization is talking about, and we can figure it out bit by bit. Some things we still don't know. There's a lot we still don't know about the Sumerian and Assyrian culture, but we're getting closer. Okay, so that's cuneiform. The term cuneiform comes from cuneus, Latin for wedge. Let's see if I missed anything. Nope. Okay. The next one we're going to be looking at is what's called cylinder seals. We've seen stamps like you see in the old-timey pictures, or they still sell them actually, stamps for like letters, right? You put wax on it, you stamp it, and that means that if the seal is broken, that's a problem, and this seal is mine. That's actually the origination of the papal ring, or the bishop's ring that the bishops wear. They have a certain insignia, and then they would stamp it. This is coming from the bishop. Similar thing here, except the Sumerians would make these what's called cylinder seals out of pottery. And when the clay was still soft, they would carve these intricate designs into them, and then they would fire them or bake them. And if you have a hole in them, you can wear it around your neck. That's like your signature, and that's what you wear.
Oh, fun.
And then when you're finishing a tablet, now this is especially for important people, kings, princes, people who are in charge of grain storehouses. Seems like a blue-collar job. Back then, that was like the third most highest ranking guy in the kingdom.
Making those?
No, being in charge of the grain storehouses. Because famine, you don't want it, right? So these high-ranking people had these cylinder seals. So when you're done writing whatever you're writing on your tablet, at the very bottom you take it and you just roll it, and that's your signature. And that just means this guy wrote this. This is an actual important document. And I use the term document, tablet, whatever. But that's a cylinder seal. They also had these other ones that are more like stamps that we can see that we can press on. We don't know whose they are, but we just know it must have been important because we only see these types of imprints on very important documents. You don't see it on a recipe for making beer.
Yeah.
Some of them became very intricate over time. So pictures of an ibex or an antelope of some kind, and there's actually two of them there. So you can see it rotates once and you get two impressions. And you do see them here. So we don't know why they wrote over this section, but this was the beginning. This is small, by the way. This is only like this big. It looks really big. This is this big. And then, so this is normal. They would write something, some sort of, and again, I don't know what this says. I should have looked it up. But this is some sort of an important document, probably having to do with food. I don't know. And then you roll the signature on the bottom, but I don't know if they made a mistake or they needed to do a PS because they wrote over it and then they fired it.
Wait, sorry, is that a lion?
Mm-hmm. Or it's an animal of some sort. Probably a lion. A lion was, as we'll see, a very important animal in this civilization, in this culture.
So are they kind of like Egyptians?
Yeah, there's a lot of similarities. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And the language was very similar too, whereas it started out very much as pictograms, like letters that look like things, and then it developed into a written language. The Egyptians kept with their hieroglyphics the entire time. Yeah.
So there are people that can actually read this, not just guessing what it says.
Yeah, with pretty good certainty. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's crazy.
Yep. Okay. So Sumer was the first among the four quarters. So it was the first in time and also the most powerful during this period of time. We have Sumer down here, Akkad, Lagash, which is only shown as just a dot here, but it was its own civilization as well, and then the Assyrian kingdom. There was then some cooperation between these different kingdoms. They weren't always at war with each other. They would be later, but they weren't always at war with each other, at least at the beginning. There was a lot of shared resources and a lot of shared knowledge. And the Sumerians helped with these other civilizations to kind of get them going. So this was a loosely grouped city-state known as Sumer, came under domination of Sargon of Akkad. So there's a guy, Akkad, we think it was right around here, but we know the civilization must have been around here, but we think it was headquartered here. Again, here's Babylon, the modern-day capital of Iraq, and then Sumeria. So this all became kind of one loosely coalesced group of nations or city-states. Sargon of Akkad had a grandson. His name was Naram Sin. And this is the first epic work of art that we have in written history. This is called the Victory Stele of Naram Sin. And it tells us a lot. It tells us quite a bit. This is made out of a pink limestone, so it has crumbled, it has decayed over time, but it's still in pretty good condition. So a stele, what is a stele? There's your definition. A stone or wooden slab generally taller than it is wide, erected in the ancient world as a monument. Grave stelae were often used for funerary or commemorative purposes. Yes, headstones, those are steles. We still use them today.
How big was the stele? Because like last time the picture looked really big.
Yeah, this one is about 4 feet to 5 feet tall.
That's big.
Okay. So yeah, pretty big. So we're going to go into different sections here and look at them. What is this victory stele? Well, as you can imagine, it's 6 feet tall. 6 feet.
Oh, dang.
It celebrates the triumph of King Naram Sin over a mountain people, the Lulabi. So there was this little tribe of people, the mountain people, called the Lulabi, and the king came in and conquered them and took them over. And this is basically a monument showing his greatness. So, if you're King Naram Sin, why would you make this? Propaganda. Meaning what?
Like showing greatness to the people and like I'm great, so
Mm-hmm.
Don't
mess with me. Yep. 100%. 100%. It's going to be propaganda for his own people, reminding them how great he is. You're so lucky to have me as a ruler. Look at what I did to those people. We still do this today, right? But it's also going to be seen as a deterrent, right? This was placed in a very prominent place in the city where neighboring communities who weren't part of this city-state by itself would come and ask for grain and ask for resources, and they'd be able to see it and go, don't mess with this guy. This is a narrative sculpture. What do we mean by a narrative sculpture? Just like a narrative paper. It tells a story. And there were other artworks that have been discovered in the past, especially from the Sumerians, but this one is different. The Sumerian depictions in clay or sometimes even in stone were written in a left to right fashion. So this starts here, this starts here, this starts here. This is showing things in almost a cyclical fashion. All right, so let's go back to the very front. It's kind of hard to see here. Who's the king in here?
That.
The top, the Viking guy.
Yep, that guy. Why? He's big.
Yeah.
He's the biggest guy. We'll talk about that when we learn more about stylization and cultural stuff. But so he's being shown as the head of this great nation. We have his soldiers who are seen as upright, of course, standing below him, looking above him in awe. Right? You can and you can do this by yourself. Meaning you can look at this work of art and try and figure things out on your own. Right? This is just what I'm doing too. We have these people who are standing upright, they're part of his army. Why? Because they're standing directly under him, they're looking up at him in awe. And then we have the people over on the right. This guy is crying for mercy, this guy has a spear through his throat, this guy's falling off a cliff, being thrown off a cliff, and basically everyone on the right is being shown as being utterly defeated. Okay, so pretty strong propaganda.
So his own soldiers are being killed by him?
No,
No,
the
the-
soldiers on the left are his. Soldiers on the right are, either crying for mercy or being killed or
So
being
what's going
tossed
on
off.
with the leaf?
What's that?
What's going on with the leaf there?
That's a tree.
Greenery.
That's just some sort of decoration on it. Yeah.
It always need greenery.
They're like,
places.
bit
Yeah.
of spice.
Yeah. Lay it down.
Something else kind of interesting here. We have writing.
I know.
So we have the ability to tell exactly what's going on with this work of art. Again, context helps a lot. So the Assyrians, the Sumerians would do this all the time. They would show, here's what's going on. In case you're too stupid to be able to figure this out, this is what's going on. This guy's great. Something else we have is look at the figure of Naram Sin. How is he standing? And how is he doing that? Because that ain't natural.
Yeah, is that a sword in between him? On his arm? It's kind of
He's holding a bow.
No, like on his other arm. Yeah, what is that?
I'm not sure. Yeah, maybe some sort of sword or an axe or something. Okay, let's take a look and see how he's standing.
Yes. Yeah, act it out. Let's see it. Nice.
That's not comfortable.
And you have the same ear too.
He's trying to
Thank
eat
you.
flesh.
So this is not natural in the slightest. Why depict someone totally contorted?
Because you can only do it like on the 2D surface.
Yeah, it's easier.
Yeah.
It's a lot easier to do it that way. And then over time, it becomes a convention. The Egyptians are actually going to borrow this. If you look at any Egyptian art, you look at people, they're always standing that way. Feet that way, body that way, head that way. Uncomfortable. But
Good stuff.
I've actually seen one where the feet are that way, the body's that way, and the head's that way. And it's like, I don't like that. Yeah.
Was there writing? Is
Good back then.
it like pictures that represent something, or is it actually like a letter?
Early on it was, but at this point it's not.
Okay.
So over about 500 to 1,000 years, they're able to develop it in such a way that it becomes sort of like an alphabet. Yep.
Is there a reason for the color difference, or is that just it being old?
It's rust.
It's just old and water damage and things like that.
Us don't rust.
He's wearing this horned helmet.
Rust.
The lion.
This is showing him as powerful. This is also showing him as very close to godlike.
Oh,
The gods at the time were always depicted with horns in this culture, and so the people
he's only a
who,
Viking.
the people who are close to the gods or are godlike are also depicted wearing helmets with horns. Because it's kind of hard to tell, but these
Those
are
look like
depictions of
suns.
sun gods.
Yeah. They're sunflowers.
So those are deities up there, and it's showing him being very tall, being very close to them, and he's getting
He's working his way up.
information.
Oh.
He's going up a mountain, and this is telling some of the story of the battle, but then up here, we also have some depictions of laws that
Sounds like
a man who's going up to a mountain is being given by God
that's
on a piece of stone.
What
They
the heck?
prophesied.
Ah,
That's so weird.
Moses!
Yeah, Moses, that's
We don't
Moses.
know.
Maybe this was a good religion back then.
Maybe we don't know.
The horn.
We don't know. We do know that the Israelite culture was later than this.
What religion were you supposed to follow then?
Huh?
What religion were you supposed to follow then?
Let's be Catholic today. So, I thought you were joking.
No.
Because well, this is not right. You follow Moses.
Yeah, but this
No, but this is before.
yeah.
Before
No,
Israelites.
you
So,
said what religion were you supposed to follow back then?
like before,
But this is made up. This isn't real.
Wait, this is before Moses?
this was an actual battle.
This was an actual battle.
Right, so the people back then, what were they supposed to follow? Like, what religion were they supposed to follow?
They probably followed
I
this.
don't understand timelines.
But it's a wrong religion.
Right, but it's.
I really don't.
But we'll talk about.
Was there a right religion?
Right, we'll talk about this in theology. Right, there was a right religion. This was absolutely pagan.
What was the right religion?
Yeah, because you can't just like give them like nothing
Was there
and like expect them to get to heaven with nothing.
Was there even a religion?
Like, was there a good religion?
Yes, what God told Adam and Eve to do, and the early, like Abraham, that guy.
What if you're on like the opposite side of the world and you've never heard of it? Like, how is that your fault?
You can still get to heaven, right? Baptism of desire. Mm-hmm. So these
What if they
people,
never heard of that?
yeah, these people definitely had the ability to go to heaven with baptism of desire. Certainly.
But they still want to do that.
You
Some
really
tough love.
So we think it's probably just a coincidence that this happened. There's probably actually no connection between the two stories of
That's
Naram
so
Singh
crazy.
and Moses. Guys, it probably actually didn't happen. He just probably made it up. Because if you think about it, it makes sense. Where's God in the sky? Like, even the most prehistoric peoples think this way, right? Well, how do you get close to God? You go up to a mountain. Oh, I talked with God, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So it kind of makes sense from a human standpoint. Okay. Here's another stele. So this is this is one about 500 years later. This is the stele of Hammurabi.
How do you carve that?
Takes a long time because this is very,
7 foot tall.
very strong stone. This is not limestone. This is basalt, which is it's almost glass-like. It's a very, very dense, very strong stone, volcanic stone.
Is it like fragile or is it like breakable like glass?
It's not as fragile as glass, but it can break. You can see how it's been put together in certain places. So basalt, yeah, you would make arrowheads out of this. It was very strong, and you could get it very sharp. Yeah,
So would these civilizations like carry this
Yeah,
art
like
with
actual
them?
airheads.
And that's how
it would just stay.
it would
stay. Yep.
Okay.
And if that civilization fell, it just fell.
So, what's the reason for only doing the top? Why leave the bottom just plain?
It's not. So we'll get
It's
there.
already.
That you were
So if you've ever looked at the history of law in any sort, Hammurabi is the first guy who develops a codified system of laws, and this is basically what this is. So what do we have up top? We'll look at the top first. Here's the depiction of Hammurabi. He's the leader over on the left. He is shown as smaller, even though he's a little bit taller. He's shown as smaller than God, or one of the gods. Yeah, one of the gods wearing a horned, pointy hat. So that's how you can tell it's one of the gods. He's handing Hammurabi, in this hand, a ring and a scepter. Basically, again, this idea, this myth that Hammurabi made up that God is giving me power to rule over the people. Right? There's always this connection between God's authority and my authority. Right? We'll see this all the time throughout
So
history.
is there any correlation between this and the history of the popes getting the ring and
No. Just rings were always seen as a symbol of some sort of a power. They were difficult to make. They were made out of precious stones. Only the very rich could afford them. It meant you had some sort of power or wealth. Right. So we have the god figure over here, seated on a throne. These little divots represent mountains because in the mythology of the time we have this god Shamash. He was seen as rising from the mountains every morning. So similar to like a sun god, like the Egyptians would have. So he would rise from the mountains every morning. So he was always depicted with these mountains on the side or underneath of him. Again, giving the symbols of power to Hammurabi, and Hammurabi is in a deferent pose, like showing deference to the god figure.
He's crossing his arms.
Yeah.
Putting his hand on his chest.
It's like, huh.
He's like, whatever.
Is this the right choice?
Yeah.
Fine.
Okay,
It has
so this is
wings
just.
on- It has like wings on like the guy.
He's
Mhm.
floating.
He's levitating.
I'm not sure if that's clouds or wings or bacon.
That's what was
The third.
Okay. All right. So why show this? Why carve this in this basalt? It's very difficult to do.
Because you can get really detailed.
You can get detailed, but also what?
It's precious.
Not breakable.
Not breakable. It's more permanent. It's heavy. It's gonna stay put. No one's gonna move it. No one's gonna take it.
It is like a good cat.
This is 7.
Wait, so it's heavy.
It's very heavy. It's very dense. There's probably almost a ton, right? 7 feet tall. So it's this big.
That's
That's only 7 feet.
Well, I'm 6, so that's 7.
You're 6.
No, you're
Just
not.
just short of 6. Actually. So yeah, right about here. That's 7 feet.
Holy
Right,
crap. God. That is.
The bottom is not blank.
Oh, really?
This is covering the entire base of the sculpture.
Oh,
That looks
wow.
boring.
Can you read it for us?
No, nope, not even gonna try.
That is so neat though. That's like Chinese.
This is the first. This is the first systematic codification of laws, of rights. So this isn't just don't do this. It's also saying people have the right to this. This is the first complex system of laws that we know of that was written down and that we still have today.
Are
And it was actually the basis of a lot of law that came about after it.
are like the dots. This sounds really stupid, but are the dots like the periods?
No, they're not.
Okay.
Those are just pockmarks or something from the history.
Mm.
So again, this is about 4,000 years old, 3,700 years old.
That's not bad.
So
There are some 300 or so entries. Some of them are dealing with commercial and property matters, others with domestic problems and physical assault. There are extremely eerie correlations between what Hammurabi wrote and what would later appear in Judaic law. If a man were to pluck out another man's eye, one eye should be blinded.
wait, I don't understand.
An eye for an eye. We see this in the scriptures, right? So there's probably this correlation between the two. I'm not saying that this was divinely inspired. I'm not saying that at all. But there's this idea of justice, right? That Hammurabi brought about. Could Hammurabi have been influenced by God to do some of this?
Questionable.
Maybe. At the very least, he's following natural law, right? What is natural law? To go into theology for a second, natural law is this idea that man has the laws of God imprinted on his soul. Right? We all have it. Aristotle, Plato, pagans in the jungle, us today, we have it. We know it's wrong to kill people. We know it's wrong to cheat on your spouse. Those types of things, right? That's pretty common across all civilizations, across all cultures. That comes directly from God. So maybe Hammurabi was just very smart. We know he was smart and was able to kind of tap into this natural law better than a lot of other people. We don't know.
So, are we sure, like, they had different gods? They didn't have one god? Because we're sure that
They were
they weren't
pantheistic.
all, okay.
They were pantheistic, so they were pagan. So in my opinion, I haven't talked to a theologian about this or a priest or anything. In my opinion, I think we can kind of lump Hammurabi in the same sort of arena as like an Aristotle or Plato. You know, Thomas Aquinas would go back to Aristotle all the time and say he was the great philosopher. There's a lot we can gain from Aristotle, Aquinas said. I think we can kind of see Hammurabi in the same vein. He did some pretty evil stuff too. I'm not saying he was a saint. I'm not saying he's in heaven. Who knows? But I think he was able at the least to tap into that natural philosophy, that natural law that he had. You know, again, not saying he's a model of anything. Some other rules. Sorry. Number 7 says, if anyone buy from the son or the slave of another man without witness or a contract, silver or gold, a male or female slave, an ox or a sheep or an ass or anything, if he take it in charge, he is considered a thief and shall be put to death. So basically saying, if you don't have a contract, if you don't have a written record between some sort of a transaction between another person, you're a thief, you'll put to death. So these are very stringent, very strict laws. But it definitely helped keep law and order.
Verse like two farmers, they couldn't just like trade anything without having a
You have to
record.
have a little clay tablet and records.
So where was
They
this
were-
placed?
This was placed right in the central part of the kingdom, right
So
next
this
to the
is still
palace.
in Sumeria, right?
I don't know where it is. It might be in the British Museum. I'm not sure.
No, but I'm saying like this was during Sumerian.
Uh-huh.
So if like you had a family, you were buying food for your family, or whatever, you have a ton of written records.
I don't know. I don't know how specific that was, but maybe it was just for
Maybe
larger.
it was like trading.
Maybe it's
So
for
what if
larger
you were
things.
caught with one of these rules, like do something bad?
Yeah, you put to death.
No. What if you were caught like doing something bad that was like going against the laws that they were put down? What happens?
Well, it lists all the punishments. So for every infraction, it lists also a punishment. So, like if you did something to injure another neighbor's eye, your eye was put out then.
Oh my goodness.
Number 55, if anyone opens his ditches to water his crop, but is careless, and the water floods the fields of his neighbor, then he shall pay his neighbor's corn for his loss.
Again.
So if you screw up your neighbor's crop because you're trying to water yours, then you owe your neighbor corn.
That's like today.
It makes sense, right? So a lot of these make a lot of sense. A lot of them are pretty rough. Another one said, if you're a builder, like an architect, what we would call today, if you're a builder and the house collapses and it kills the person who's living inside of it, then you are put to death by basically stones being placed on you until you're crushed.
What was on accident?
Yeah, what's this?
Natural
Build
disaster.
better
built
stuff.
The building.
Natural
and it
disaster.
Killed people. That's
Then you're put to death.
Probably worse.
You should tell that one to your dad. See what he says.
That's not true.
Okay.
I won't remember.
So there's this concept of an eye for an eye, right? There's this concept of things, we're always trying to make sure that there's justice. It's a system of control, but again, not in a bad sense. You need to have that control in order to have a civilization, to have a culture. By about 1400 BC, about 300 years after this, after the Stele of Hammurabi was erected, there was a great period of peace basically throughout this area, but then we had the Assyrians come in. The Assyrians were up here and then they swept into power. The Egyptians even at the time talk about this. It was huge news, and the Assyrians would be a thorn in the side of the Egyptians. We'll see that later. The Assyrians would always try to come in and conquer, and they actually succeeded towards the end of the New Kingdom in Egypt. But the Assyrians, very much a warlike people, didn't care so much about rules. Sumerians and Akkadians, much more peace-loving. Like, let's just do our settlements and let's, they had wars too, but they weren't always on this idea of conquest for power. The Assyrians come down, they sweep in, and they take over this area. The Assyrians had as their ruler I can't say that word, Assur-Nasrpal. Assur-Nasrpal. Got it. Assur, and I misspelled it there. I always spell it that way. Assur-Nasrpal, it's not that. Anyway, spelling is not important on a test, don't worry.
Really?
Thank
Really.
goodness.
So by about 1400 BC, 1400 years before Christ, the Assyrians come into power. By the 9th century BC, so the early 1000s, they control most of Mesopotamia. And they're erecting palaces. And again, just like before, they're going to be telling their story.
Oh my.
This is the king, Assur-Nasrpal.
The line is.
And he is on a chariot, and he's killing lions.
He's gonna miss.
Aw. I know.
This is what we call a relief
Give him a
sculpture.
shake.
We're gonna talk more about what a relief sculpture is when we get to Greece. But for now, know that this is just it's called a low relief sculpture. You're just barely carving into the surface a little bit. We have
Is this for chariot racing?
they didn't do it for racing, they would do it for hunting. And they would do it for transport, especially for the royalty and nobility. Pretty difficult to make these still at the time, and so it was reserved for higher people. But Assur-Nasrpal, he's killing lions. This is not showing necessarily a battle, but this is a very long relief sculpture. You can see this is where it's installed now in the British Museum. So they were able to carefully lift these
Yeah, how
stones,
did they do that?
carefully lift them, and then bring them and install them into the.
Wait,
How would you put them into the wall without like drilling into?
you
like,
probably
crack
don't.
them?
You
Oh,
probably
you just
like
put cement on it.
cement.
Super glue or something? I don't know. Maybe you've got like little
I'm good.
like frames around them. I'm not sure.
Wait, so only the king was allowed to hunt the lions?
Only the king was allowed to hunt lions. This is showing his power. If you kill a lion, you're put to death.
Oh,
Oh
dang.
dear.
But if the king hunts it, it's fine.
Oh, he's fine.
What if it's out of self-defense?
Yeah.
Don't know. Don't know.
It's amazing.
That's pretty cool.
The rest of the sculpture is showing this kind of procession. And this is a guy in front, kind of showing how big it is. Showing a procession. All of these people again are kind of faceless. I mean, they have faces, but there's no distinguishing characteristics, right? There's no emotion. There's no distinguishing characteristics. There's just this idea that the rest of the people don't matter. Who matters is the king.
It's a briefcase.
And they're carrying the dead lion after the hunt. And we can see they're shown. We start to see a little bit more profile here. But the king is shown in a very specific way, right? He's still shown in this kind of profile way. Yeah.
Would they eat the lion? Because don't they like have reverence for them?
I don't know if they did or not. I don't know. Okay. There's stiffness, there's lack of emotion, there's no emotion going on here, right? This is very basic sculpture. You're just showing people, that's all it is. Even in the king, when he's in the middle of a hunt, should be like excited or scared or happy or nope, he's just like, sit.
I would say just put that
I
line.
don't understand their hair. What's up with you like doing perfect?
Whoa, nice
Okay.
picture.
So next
Those are cool
class,
outfits.
we're gonna stay in the
That's from
ancient Near East,
It's Richard Madden.
and we're gonna go down to Ur. Finish the prehistoric.
Rise of
So we're ancient.
See ya.
Thank you. Bye.